Well, thank you girls and guys for coming. My name is Branda Curtis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my history in quilting first before we get started on the history of quilts. I am 49 years old. I have 3 sons from 32 to 18. And I have collected antique quilts since I can remember. I have a lot of heirloom quilts that were my grandmother's, and then my husband, fortunately, was both of his grannies on both sides quilted, so I inherited those quilts also. So last I counted, I had over 150. But I tell my husband all the time, I said, we'll count quilts when you count fishing tackle, so we don't count quilts. So I started sewing when I was young enough to hold a needle and thread. My grandmother raised me, so I was very fortunate to have her. And anyways, that'll make me cry. I learned to sew on a treadle machine. I remember when she got her motor on that treadle machine, and I wasn't allowed to use it anymore because she was afraid I'd sew my finger with it then. But so I've been making quilts ever since. I made my first quilt when I was 13, finished it, completed it at 13, but I helped her with many, many before that. I was the manager in historic Granville for almost 8 years. That was after I met Miss Mary Beth. That is a little historic town, and they have lots of history there. So I fell in love with it because they had the museums, and I could tell my story about the old quilts because I love to quilt, but this is my passion. I love the old quilts and the connection that I feel with those ladies and them as they made these quilts. So we'll get started. Is anybody in here not a quilter? I guess that's the best question to ask. Well, I say all the time that quilting is one thing that I think everyone has in common, because you may not quilt, but you either had a grandparent that quilted, you have a quilt, or you've seen a quilt, or have been around someone that hand sewed or sewed. So we all have quilts in common, I think. So the history of quilting, some of this stuff I'm going to read because I can't memorize it all. We're going to start with quilting in general and its beginning. And I'm sorry if when the Dutch and English settlers introduced quilting into the United States, quilters maintained a practical approach to their craft. Since daily chores included spinning and weaving, there was little time for quilting, much less artistic quilting. When times become hard, these functional blankets were made from recycled scraps because they didn't throw away anything back then, they kept it. Quilting traditions emerged across the country, such as quilting bees. At quilting bees, quilters gathered together for a social event where several quilts could be made at one time. In the mid-1800s, the landscape of America transformed as the Industrial Revolution led to the development of technology like the sewing machine. As textiles and sewing machines become readily available, more families were able to create artistic applique quilt designs and more that had previously been created by only the upper class. In the 1970s, whole cloth quilts designs were extremely popular. A whole cloth quilt design were made by sandwiching large pieces of fabric together and creating a design through the stitching. Beginning in the mid-1700s, applique patterns were popular with upper-class women who had the time and the wealth, allowing them to create such elaborate designs. Opposite applique were patchwork quilts, known for their practical purposes and scrap-busting qualities. So if you know anything about quilting, you know the difference in a whole cloth quilt, an applique, and piecing. Whole cloth quilts is the oldest that we know of, and that's basically where they took one piece of fabric and all the beauty was in the quilting, the 3 pieces together. So this one on the top, I'm going to talk a little bit about old quilts and how they were practical. I tell kids, when I do for children, I tell them all the time, I explain it in the way that they recycled back then, like better than we did. They didn't even have a trash can. They kept everything. So when the quilt wore out and they couldn't use it anymore, they would not throw it away. They would just put another back on it and put another top on it and re-quilt it. Have you ever seen these tack quilts that has just the tacking? That's because as the quilts got thicker and thicker through the ages, they could no longer get their little needle and thread through it because it was so thick, so they would just tack it. And that made for those heavy quilts. I can remember being sick and having the flu. My grandmother would pile those quilts on top of me until I sweated and sweat that fever out, and I couldn't move. I'd just be laying there paralyzed by the heavy quilts on top of me, and it might just be 3 quilts because they were so heavy. This one here I'm going to talk to you about first is just that. I found this old quilt in Gatlinburg. My husband and I stopped at a junk sale, and I told him, I said, I want to go in there, and he's like, okay. So he looks at his watch, and I go in. Anyways, I go up in this barn, and there's a big pile of quilts, and the rodents had gotten to them, and they were soiled, and there were some beautiful quilts there, but they were beyond repair. And I dug through and found this one, which was in the better shape, but the lesser of the valuable quilts. It didn't look very pretty and didn't have much, but I could tell it probably had an old quilt inside of it. And so this is the example I want to show you of that. And there is a place here in Murfreesboro at Oakland's, and they've got one that, or they did have one that had 4 or 5 quilts inside of it. This one here, as you fold back, you can see that's got a whole quilt in there. Batting, and they even, I noticed when I was taking this apart, they put another piece of batting on top of that quilt before they put this top and this back on it. I say all the time, the quilts have stories to tell, and even this ugly one that probably no one would want has a story to tell. It's very heavy. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more before I get into the quilt turning, sorry. I have no rhyme or reason, sorry, I'll just... So applique comes from the medieval times when fabric was scarce and expensive. The best pieces were cut from worn out textiles and sewn to the background fabric to make a new piece of cloth. This is the technique used in later years for some of the first applique bed covers. Piecing, and I'm going to say this, I say this all the time, don't quote me on that because I just do my best at research and there's probably other dates out there. But from the 1830s onward, patterns of geometric quilt blocks were pieces of fabric sewn together to make a design. So who's heard of a crazy quilt? So crazy quilts, I have always heard, dates back to early 1800s. You basically have no pattern. You just have this big basket of scraps and you sew them together until you get something big enough to quilt and make a quilt top. But I know the crazy quilts, they would go and do very pretty handwork. They might be just an old crazy quilt, but they would have so much handwork in them. Every little piece, they would do a different stitch around, embroidery stitch. I have one in the museum that was made in 1911, and it's made of 100% silk, 100% silk. Well, silk doesn't stand the age like cotton does, and so it's very feeble and very fragile. You can't even hardly pick it up that you don't feel like it's just going to tear to pieces. But the quilt's made from 100% silk, and they're all different pieces. So I don't know the story of it. The lady did put her date and her initials on it. It is one that I have just picked up at an auction, so I don't know the story behind it, but I don't know where you would get that much silk. I mean, there's probably 300 different pieces of silk in there. So I just imagine maybe she was a dressmaker or something like that, and she saved her silk pieces and made the quilt. And another thing, it doesn't have any batting in it. They made summer and winter quilts and bedspreads, basically. That, I think, was a bedspread, and the grandchildren would not have been allowed to sleep on that. The summer quilts, some of them don't even have, and I've got one or two to show you that don't even have batting in it. So they would make the quilt and not put any batting, because obviously back then they did things for a reason, where we just do it. Today's quilting, we make pretty things and we have fun doing it. Back then they made them for a reason, and that was to either keep warm or cover up with. And so the summer quilts have no batting in them. The winter quilts would have as much batting as they could get in them to keep warm. Told you they didn't throw anything away. They saved every piece. I have quilts at home that my grandmother made, and I remember Easter dresses and aprons and stuff made out of them. They would cut the bad pieces away and just save what was left. The better pieces of the fabric they would save to put in quilts or patch your pants. I seen a girl the other day with her pants all torn, and I said, if my grandma seen those pants, she would patch those and you would not be going to school with those breeches. And she said, Miss Brenda, I bought them like this. I was like, well, I want the job that gets the new pants and wears them until they're wore out, and then I'll give them to them. So to say we know how many quilt patterns there is, no, we don't. There's thousands. And 9 chances out of 10, if you're a quilter, you have a favorite technique, or you either like applique or piecing or paper piecing, and I could stand here and go on and put y'all to sleep. So the process of quilting. I know most of you are quilters, so I don't have to tell you the process, but some of us are not. So I'm going to tell you that quilting is multiple processes. There is making the quilt top, which is what 90% of us enjoy doing the most. And then there is quilting the quilt. Quilting is when you put the back, the batting, and the top together, and then you sew through all 3 layers. That is actually quilting. And most of us don't do that part, and I can promise you that most of us don't hand quilt like our grandmothers and moms did, because we have a new thing called a sewing machine. And I tell everybody, they're like, well, why don't you hand quilt? And I'm like, well, if my grandma had that Husqvarna, she would have sewed on that. She would have not used her needle and thread. And I tell them also, they were like, well, how many quilts do you have? And I'm like, well, I've probably made over 200, but I would have 2 if I hand sewed, because I would still be working on the second one. So this one here is just a rough old quilt. I like to think of boys going off to war, and the quilt that their mama would have sent with them would have been like this one here or this one. It would not have been one of these beautiful quilts I'm going to show you underneath here, because it was more of a multi-purpose quilt. And this one has seen its better days. I don't know the story of this one. I do know there is another quilt hiding in here though. And I haven't taken the time to take it apart to see, but most of the time when I take these apart, for instance this one here, that quilt underneath is worn to shreds because this wool has rubbed on that cotton all these years, and I mean it's literally powder in there. So I decided I didn't want to take it all the way apart. I just wanted to take apart enough to just maybe I could see the pattern of what the quilt was in there. So that one I think is probably a 9 patch under there, which we're going to talk some more about the different patterns and all that. So okay. Let's talk about tools for a second. I tell everybody when they come in the shop, they're like, well, how did you start? And I'll say, my grandma taught me, and she gave me a pair of scissors and a piece of cardboard and some fabric and said, cut out 3 million of these and then come back to me. And I was like, what? And here I am still quilting. But today we have rotary cutters and mats and rulers, and we can measure, and we have pre-cuts, which is my favorite. And I could just get a pre-cut and I could start sewing, and I can have a quilt, not in a day, but pretty quick. The tools have changed. Obviously, they're sewing machines, and back in these days, they didn't have sewing machines. I think the majority of the quilts I brought today, don't quote me on it, I think everything I brought is pretty much 100% hand sewn. I do have some in my museum that do have some machine quilting on them, but it's just because it was an old top that I acquired and I wanted to finish it. And people are forever bringing in quilt tops. I think that's probably 80% of my people that come in and they are like, I got an old quilt top and it was my grandmother's. What do I do with it? Well, first off, you need to finish that quilt, because if you hand that down to the next generation, they're going to see it as, what am I going to do with that? So get it quilted, get it finished, because they're going to value a quilt that's finished more than they will a quilt top. So I do encourage them, even if it's a hand-pieced quilt top, I'm like, get it machine quilted, because they're going to be able to use it. Hand quilting is wonderful, but it wasn't for our modern washing machines. You don't want to put these quilts in a washing machine. There won't be much left of them when you get them out after they go through the wringer. So I do encourage people to get their quilt tops finished, especially if they're heirloom. So the dating fabric. I've taken 3 or 4 classes. I don't know if y'all have heard of a lady named Kay England. She specializes in Civil War era fabrics and that era, which is really my passion. But I have learned a little bit about the 30s fabric. I'm sure most of you quilters know about the reproduction fabric of the 30s, feed sacks. Back in the 30s, they started putting the feed in pretty feed sacks, making them out of fabric. So that made the women that tended the chickens and all that want to go to the feed store and pick out their own feed so they could get the fabric from the feed sack, and then they made quilts and dresses and on and on and on out of those. And so nowadays they make a reproduction of those fabrics, and they're very, very beautiful and vibrant. When we came over from England or wherever we came over from, most of the fabrics were bigger prints, and that's because they had the factories and stuff over there. So when we settled America and we started all over basically from scratch here, most of the prints, early prints or small prints, are solid prints because they were literally just dyed. It was later on that we started getting bigger prints, and I'll show you some examples and I'll talk mostly about Civil War era just because that's my passion and I've learned the most about it. I don't know a lot about the other eras, so I'll tell you what I know, but I'm not an expert, so don't scream at me if I'm wrong. So I think, let's talk about taking care of old quilts. Does anybody have old quilts? So the best way to fold them is with the pretty side in. So when you fold your old quilts, you want to fold this side out and fold the pretty side in. And I store mine in pillowcases. I'll tell you a little story. There was a family rivalry going on, kind of small. My husband and his uncle, and anyway, so the granny passed away and everybody had been through the house and got everything they wanted. So it was our turn to go through. So we went to Granny Wilkie's and we started looking around, and there was some sewing boxes, and I was like, oh yeah, I get her sewing box. So I go to the closet and I'm looking, and there was blankets, and I look up in all 4 closets, there's pillows. And I thought, what is Granny Wilkie doing with all these pillows? What does she want so many pillows for? They're just pillows, just bed pillows. Girl, there was 12 quilts in those pillowcases. Chill bumps. 12 quilts in those pillowcases. I started pulling them down and opening them up. They were folded with the ugly side out, so they just looked and thought, oh, we don't want those. They didn't know what those were. Girl, I opened those up. When you come to my quilt museum, you will see those quilts. Amazing, amazing quilts. But anyways, so I was like, I got the best thing. You guys can have the house. But most of her quilts never even seen a sewing machine. So they're absolutely beautiful. Okay. I was going to tell you too about caring for quilts. Obviously you don't put an old quilt in the washing machine. I'm sure y'all are all smart enough to know that. When I soak them, there's a thing called retro soak. And it's like just a mild detergent, and I will do it in the bathtub in warm water. They recommend you actually put them in like a tucker tote and set them in the sun for 24, or as long as you can. Obviously you can't leave it in the sun for 24 hours, but to set them out in the sun as long as you can, that the sun is a better heating element than just putting them in the cold bathtub. And I do the best I can at soaking them, and then put them in the washing machine on the spin cycle only for just a few minutes. But when you pick those quilts out of that tub, let me tell you from experience, they're going to weigh 50 pounds. So put them in the tucker tote, get them to the washing machine, put them on spin just enough to knock the water out, and then hang them and dry them. And that's the best. And if they're really fraying, if they're really fraying bad, I wouldn't even do that because they will fall apart. So anyways, any questions about caring for quilts? I don't roll mine. I do know people that do, but 95% of the quilters I know fold them and put them in a pillowcase, especially if we're taking them to a quilt show or something like that, just because it's just better to fold them that way. My grandmother used to tell me that you needed to refold the quilts. Like, I have closets of quilts, and she would say, well, you need to refold those because the edges that's outside will get worn more than, so if you just take them, open them up, refold them a different way, it keeps them from wearing on those edges. I've seen old quilts, and there may be one in here that you can tell it's folded for years and years and years because those edges were worn. So we're going to fold this one up. No questions about this quilt, right? He's one of my favorites. If you get a fever, this is the one we're covering you up with. He's not pretty. See the back? It's even pieced. They didn't go to Aunt Bee's farmhouse and buy fabric for their quilts. They had to use what they had. So this one here is a repair that I do repairs. I call myself rescuing the quilts because, like I said, I do make quilts, girls, but this is my passion. I love to fix a quilt. If I can fix it and it can still stay in a quilt state, I'm very happy. They do all kinds of stuff with old quilts these days. They cut them up and make dolls, and I'm okay with that if the quilt wasn't savable. But most of the time, you can get a baby quilt at the least out of a quilt. And if you could cut enough out of that quilt to make a baby quilt for a granddaughter or a great-granddaughter or a grandchild, then that's a great thing. So this one here, the lady brought to me, and she's like, Brenda, I don't know if it's repairable. It's literally not much, but she said her children grew up with this blanket and they fought over it. When they watch TV, they rub the edges, and she said they're 50-something and they're still fighting over this little quilt. And it's nothing but a cheater cloth, or cheater quilt they call it, which used to looks like it had a quilt pattern on it. And it's very nicely quilted, and it's a very heavy quilt. But I noticed when she brought it to me that the only places that really had a problem were these two edges, which was obviously where they rubbed it all the time. So I told her, I said, we can take about 3 or 4 inches off of this and put a new binding on it, and this quilt will still be wonderful for display, or, you know, still can use it. There are a few places that could be patched, but like I told her, I said, if I patch it the best I can patch it, it's going to be more obvious. So she chose to just leave the little holes in it and to just replace these two sides. Any questions about that quilt? Sorry for the notes. That's the ones she told me to save the parts that I cut off because her daughter and her want to make ornaments out of those pieces.
I do have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When somebody gives you a quilt to repair, how long does it take you to get it back to them?
When someone gives me a quilt to repair, it usually takes me about 2 weeks to get it back to them, depending on the condition. That one, a few days probably. I'll have it done. So this one, and I'm going to say again that quilts have different names for all the different patterns. So I'm going to tell you what I know the name of the pattern is, and I'm sure there's at least 4 other names. This one I know as the Tree of Life. Does anyone else know another name for this pattern? No? Well, I may be right on that one then. This one is just beautiful. Once again, she didn't have enough to do it in that lime green, and so she used what she had, and you notice there's a few there that's different. I'm sure she didn't mean to do that. It's a beautiful quilt. The age is not known. It's really hard to date solid fabrics because we've always had them. So I'm going to guess it's probably 1900s or maybe a little before, early 1900s. I do take quilts on loan at the museum. I display them for 3 months at a time. I tell your family's story. I ask you to write up something about the quilts and what you do know about them. And I tell their story. I only borrow them for 3 months and you get them back. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy if you got with me. I'd be happy to do that. This is applique, like we spoke of earlier. And this one I would tell you that is what we were talking about, tea stained. I haven't tried to clean this quilt. I just thought it was in good shape like it is. Excuse me. So I wouldn't want to, damage it by trying to wash it. I know nowadays you can buy fabric that's made to look like this. So this is pretty sought after, so I thought I'd just leave it like it is. It has the antique look. It has been repaired a few times. This is just one that I have picked up at an auction or something. The paisley fabric is rare. I don't see that very often in quilts, and I'm not real sure what time period that would be. This is very minimum quilt or batting in it, so it's a real thin quilt. It may not even have any in it. If it does, it's very, very thin.
What pattern is that?
I don't know. Any girls know? Boys know? I don't know. It's kind of like leaves, though, isn't it? That's what it reminds me of. She must have had a lot of this paisley fabric because she bonded it with it, too. Yes, ma'am?
If you were to soak that in the retro, would the colors fade?
If I soak this in the retro, no, ma'am. The colors would not fade, only the stain part. It looks like it's been washed already, so I think it would be safe to say that red would be okay to wash. But once again, it's a beautiful like it is, so I'm not going to tempt fate. And if you notice, open that back up just a second. See how that quilt's been folded for so long in the same way? Thank you, ma'am. So this is a 9-patch. I'm going to talk a little more about a 9-patch because I just looked up a little bit of history on it. 9-patch is very, very common. I'm sure there's other names. Anybody know of a different name of a 9-patch? Me neither. So it's real simple. It's basically nine squares sewed together, and then obviously they're set in a bunch of different ways. This 9-patch has a sashing with cornerstones on each corner of it. I see some feed sack fabrics in there. Gingham is very popular. Once again, that's a hard one to date. But I tell everybody, if you're trying to date a quilt, find the oldest fabric you can find in it, because you know it's that old or newer. So if you say you find a 30s fabric, just because it has 30s fabric in it doesn't mean my granddaughter didn't make that quilt in the 50s or whatever. So, but because sometimes it is. Sometimes you'll find quilts and they'll have 2 or 3 different decades of fabric in them. So it's hard to say, oh, this quilt was made in this year. Not necessarily, because if y'all are like me, we hoard fabric. So we could have had that 20 years ago. So the 9-patch block, though the Amish were a little late to the community, I'll start over. Though the Amish were a little late to the quilting table, they have made a name for their own. After about 1870, the Amish joined the quilting world. Since then, Amish quilts have come to be appreciated for their fine craftsmanship and beauty. The Amish technically used solid colored patches made out of cotton or wool. The Amish have a variation of the 9-patch called the double 9-patch. During the early settlement of colonial America, every spare scrap of fabric had value. Textiles were limited in supply and were often hard to come by. The 9-patch was a necessity among pioneer women. It was an easy way to use up scraps and prevent waste again. Similarly, during war times, saving every bit of fabric was important as well. They had to adapt to sustaining in quilting and the approach to reduce, reuse, and recycle. Even though the 9-patch is simple, some of the most beautiful quilts can be made from this pattern in different variations. Thoughtfully chosen colors, textiles, and printed fabric can be assembled together to construct an amazing quilt with just 9 patches. Any questions about this quilt?
I just have a question. It doesn't look like you've put a label on any of these quilts. You label the older quilts.
I did not label these quilts. No, ma'am, I don't. But when you come to the museum, there's a write-up, kind of like what I'm reading, with each quilt. And if I have any history on the quilt as who made it, kind of the era, if there's any fabric in there that indicates a different.
So you don't recommend putting a label on an older quilt?
That's really just your own preference. I have a write-up with most of these. I've only been open 2 months, so I've not rotated my quilts. Every 3 months I'll change them. So these haven't been hung in the museum yet. Except for ones on the bottom, and they have a write-up with each one of them. So this is the log cabin. Honestly, I can say this is the most popular quilt pattern that I know of. Hundreds of different ways to lay the log cabin blocks out. I'm going to tell you a little history about the log cabin block and different people's opinions on what it meant and all that. This quilt here is amazing. It is my favorite pattern, is the log cabin. This one, she didn't have much fabric for her edges, or maybe she meant to do it, but she used different fabrics on each edge for her binding, even on the bottom. It's got a lot of calicos in it. Once again, it's a hard one to date because it does have so many different time periods in it. It screams Civil War. Not sure, you know, there might be an early, because if I say this is a Civil War fabric or Civil War quilt and we find a 30s fabric in it, then that kills that altogether, right? Because obviously that one piece of fabric couldn't have been put in the quilt. I don't see any feed sack fabric in it. I see a lot of shirt fabrics and stuff like that. So I think it could easily be Civil War era quilt. I'll tell you a little bit about the log cabin block. And I don't know why I haven't had these on the whole time because I can't see. The log cabin quilt has a rich tradition in America dating back to the mid-1800s, and according to historians, carried a special symbol. Quilt historians tell us that the log cabin design became popular about 1863, when the Union Army was raising money for the Civil War by raffling quilts. And since President Abraham Lincoln grew up in a log cabin, it is believed that the pattern name may have been a symbol of the loyalty to him as head of the Union. Once again, I'm sure there's 5 other stories. Traditionally, the small center of the log cabin block, which if you're not a quilter, I'll tell you, this is the block, and that red center, representing the cabin hearth, and surrounding with light and dark stripes, representing the firelight and shadows around the hearth. So, imagine this is the block, this is the hearth, this is the light side, this is the dark side. I also have heard that represented the heart, and since death and stuff was so common back then, that this was the happy part and this was our dark side. So, once again, hundreds of different variations, I'm sure. Sorry. The log cabin block with a black center hanging on a clothesline, some say was meant that it was a safe stop for the Underground Railroad. So again, if this red square right there was black, supposedly hang it on your line, that was a safe place they could come and seek refuge. The yellow block in the center represented a welcoming light at the window. Excuse me. Today, there are many beautiful quilted works of art using the log cabin pattern. In fact, there are entire quilt shows designed to showcase quilts made with variations of the log cabin pattern. That blows my mind. To think they could have a whole quilt show with nothing but log cabin patterns. So again, my favorite. Any questions about this quilt? Again, I haven't seen fit to wash this one. It's not in that bad a shape, and I definitely don't recommend washing them unless they're in dire need of it, because it just takes away from their life. And you know, they didn't wash their quilts. They hung them on the line and let them air dry. They didn't have a washing machine, but I don't believe that they hardly ever even got the scrub board out and scrubbed them. I think they just hung them on the line and let them air dry. Probably my top 5 favorites of my quilts. This one definitely screams Civil War era all the way. This again, different variations. Anybody want to tell me what they know the name of this one is? I had to look it up too, guys. I was like, I know that quilt pattern, but it is called a chimney sweep or Friday Night Special. Those was the 2 names I came up with. I don't know what Friday Night Special means, but it did say, and it was on the internet, so it has to be true, right? I could see chimney sweep more than the Friday Night Special. But I have also seen this pattern as a signature quilt, which is something that they did for various reasons. But they would put a signature here. We do have a quilt in Granville that is a signature quilt, and it has the 1932, or I'm sorry, 33 and 34, and it had the ladies' signatures, and they sewed over their signature and put a date in it. We found the blocks in the top of a barn, and we haven't been able to decide what these ladies had in common, where the blocks even came from. They all went to different churches, so it wasn't a church group. Maybe an FCE club is about all we've come up with, but they did do them in 33 and 34. And I set the blocks together and quilted it, and it's on display in Granville too. Any questions about this one? This is a winter quilt. One thing I noticed about this one is it's huge. Their beds are small back then. They didn't have queen size beds. It was before they standardized mattress sizes, so most beds were small. The full size are smaller. And this is a huge quilt, so I think that's pretty rare. And it is, there's hardly any batting in it, and it's tied, but there is no quilt underneath this one. So maybe she just didn't have time to quilt it, or maybe it was too big. Who knows? Any questions about this quilt? This fabric on the back screams Civil War era too. So yeah, it's precious. Ma'am?
That sashing fabric for Civil War is very beautiful.
Plaid?
The red, like that, yeah, that red plaid.
You did a good job, you know.
And they did a lot of, I mean, look, they made sure that it's the same. You know it was plaid fabric, so she made it a point to make sure that it was the same. It could be. I thought that could be ribbon.
Oh.
Feel the edge of it?
Find any of the people's names on there and see if any of those names are still alive?
Nobody is. We've got family members in town that are kin, but they don't know. They'd say, well, I don't know why Grandma made that block. I mean, they just don't know. You know, I think that could be ribbon. I do.
It's just so perfect.
You're right. That's really good. And she asked about this fabric in the sashing, and it is perfect. And I think it could be ribbon, which is very strange.
I think it would be unusual to have all the same fabric on the back. It's so
Yeah, such a huge piece. She had a lot of fabric for that. But you know, their dresses were huge. So when they got fabric for a dress, they got a lot of fabric. I know that for a fact. I've made about 17 dresses. Which way are we going, Mary Beth? This
Do
way?
you have a Civil War ball in Granville?
No, I used to do living history reenacting. And so I made the dresses, and my husband did blacksmithing, and my little boy, that's 18 now, he showed toys of that era. And so I made like 17 Southern Belle dresses, and those are on display in Granville. Okay, cathedral window. I think everybody here knows this one. This one is on loan from a friend of mine. It's her grandmother's, and it is 100% hand, and it is so heavy. Pick it up, Mary Beth, and see. It has no batting. The pattern is, it's kind of a quilt as you go sort of pattern. So there's no batting, but it's just so heavy with the different layers of fabric. This is probably 70s. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would think somewhere in the 70s, maybe. I wouldn't think 80s, but it could be. Who knows? I mean, there's fabrics from a lot. I mean, I remember having a dress myself out of that piece of fabric right there, and that one. So, and I was born in 74, so. Again, I can see her scrap basket being full and her using her scraps for this one. This technique is very odd. It's totally out of the quilting realm. So I wonder who came up with it. How did she sit down and say, oh, I'm going to take this little block and I'm going to fold this over and I'm going to stitch it, and the back of it, they're all sewed together individually. Any questions? I'm sorry about that quilt. I acquired this one. It is on loan from a friend of mine. It's not my quilt. It will be displayed after February in the museum. It's one that she just brought to me, and I was like, I'm going to take this on my trunk show, if you don't mind. She's like, sure. One of my favorites again. And as I talk about this quilt, this one's little, so you might have to come up front, Mary Beth. As I talk about this quilt, I want to tell you that many of my quilts I have in the museum, scoot back, or go this way so that lady can see. They have little things different about them. I don't know, maybe you girls can tell me after the show. Why would you do one little thing? It was either her mark, or maybe she just wanted us to ask questions like, why did she do that one block different? So on this one, I'm going to show it to you, but I hang this one in the museum. If you notice, and it's hard to see, you're welcome to come up afterwards, all her flowers in each basket are blue, except for this one. It's pink. Now, why she did that other than to make us ask questions? Or she ran out of blue. I don't know. I have so much fun asking people, why do you think she did this?
I think she had one granddaughter and she said, this block is for you.
That's a good one too. So this is a Dutch doll. Once again, I'm sure there's other names. Does anybody know a different name for a Dutch doll? Sunbonnet Sue, yes, right.
Dutch doll.
Dutch dolls, yeah.
I've never seen one made like that.
I hadn't either. This is the first time this pattern I'd seen. Most of the ones I have seen were appliqued, and this one is a pieced.
How old do you
It's
think
pieced.
that is?
It's not very old. I mean, it's got some feed sack fabric in it, so but it doesn't seem very old. And I can see this being made for a granddaughter. It's a small quilt for a small bed.
Yeah.
And I always say granddaughter. It could be a daughter, but my grandmother, I'll take that one. I can do it. So this is the last quilt, and I have the most to say about it, so I saved it for last. Any questions about the Dutch doll or Sunbonnet Sue quilt? It has very little batting in it, so it's really thin and light, so definitely not one to keep her warm in the winter. And I say this all the time, it could be from Florida. Their winters aren't as bad as ours. They probably made that type of quilt down there. So this quilt, before we get it up, I'll get it out afterwards. When I purchased this quilt, I went online and researched until I found the pattern and the story behind the pattern. And I have that with me if you'd like to flip through. This quilt was 1927 by a lady named Ruth McKim. She made multiple patterns. This was one that came out in the newspaper. Each week you would get a different pattern, and you would get the Bible story with it. I have that pattern with the stories. You're welcome to flip through. It's very nice. This quilt is just breathtaking. It's the time that she took to embroidery each one of these blocks, and the quilting is magnificent. I have always heard, and I'm sure someone will correct me, 7 stitches in an inch is good. This one has 10. And people will say how many hours, and I'm like, I would say 500, but I might be undercutting her, so I'd hate to say that. I mean, the quilting is amazing. I did notice, being a historian, I like to study. I noticed that she duplicated 5 blocks. So 5 of these blocks are duplicated. Obviously, the pattern wasn't big enough for what bed she wanted, so she just made another row, and I think maybe a full size. It was probably made for a twin, and she's like, hey, I need a bigger quilt, so she made 5 extras. And then she took the time to make that fancy little scalloped edge, which if you sew, you know that is not an easy task. This, once again, is one of those that the grandkids didn't get to sleep under. She folded it up and put it away when the grandkids come. Very simple, just blue and white. She wasn't trying to make a statement with that. She wanted to make a statement with her embroidery, I believe, in her quilting. Any questions about this quilt? Miss McKim, in the book you'll see she made gardening ones with different flowers, and I think she did one with children. She liked to do themes, so most of her patterns, oh no ma'am, New York in 1927. This pattern came out in 27, but she had them from 23 to 29, and I guess each year maybe, I'm guessing, it doesn't say it directly, but it seemed like she came out with 1 or 2 a year, and they were all in either a magazine or a newspaper. And you know, they started that to get women to buy the magazine and the newspaper, because once you started that quilt, you're going to keep buying those until you get enough to finish the quilt.
How did you come by this quilt? Where did you find it?
How did I come by this quilt? I purchased it on an auction.
And where was the auction?
It was a local estate auction in Cookeville. I don't know there was no history with the quilt, who made the quilt. I only know the history of the pattern maker.
Okay.
Any questions about this
Does it have
quilt?
a label or no? How did you
No label.
How did you know who the maker was?
I researched Bible embroidery, and then I went on and it took me hours to find the maker of the pattern. Any more questions? Well, I thank you girls and guys for coming today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll come visit the Quilt Museum and the Quilt Shop.